Imagine privilege is going to be quite a sensitive word. Briefly introduce the speaker. Geoff Budlender was once the president of NUSAS, which was the National Union of Students in South Africa, I think. And a member of that organization was Biko, but in 1968 he felt disillusioned by it and established his own organization, SASO, which is the African Student Organization, and critiqued NUSAS, grounded in black consciousness, and challenged NUSAS and Budlender to rethink their role in the anti-apartheid movement. And since we, continue to battle with racism in our institutions and our society, I think black consciousness remains an important epistemology to grapple with, but at the same time, the challenges of being white and establishing anti-racist practice remain. And so to learn from Geoff Budlender and his insider's knowledge and his experience with Biko himself, I think will remain very valuable as we move forward as young South Africans. So please help me welcome Geoff Budlender. Thanks very much.
Good evening. Thank you, Alex. I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about my experience and the experience of other white students and other black students, particularly in the late 60s and the early 70s, at the time when the black consciousness movement emerged, and the difficulties we faced, the struggles we faced, the questions we faced, the answers we tried to find, some of which I think still has some real relevance to the situation today. I'm going to start off by talking about giving some background to what NUSAS was. It was the National Union of South African Students. Then I'm going to say something about the emergence of SASO, South African Students Organization. Then I'll talk about the SASO critique of NUSAS and the critique of white activists, white liberals, white radicals, and the NUSAS response. Then I'll talk about what the white response was, and then some remarks about so where are we now in the democratic South Africa. I'll do that in less than 30 minutes. Let me start with the NUSAS background. NUSAS was established in 1924. It was a national student organization, and its main interest in the early years was bringing Afrikaans and English together. They were the two dominant nations, or sometimes races, and the main concern was to bring them together, and that was done quite successfully, but it didn't last very long. It lasted until shortly before the years of the Second World War, when on the English campuses there was a strong movement in support of the Allies, and on the Afrikaans campuses there was anything but that. There was resistance to that. There was some support for the Axis powers for historical and political reasons, which we can go into at another time, or even later if you like. But the English Afrikaans thing started to become less relevant, and after the Second World War, as in many other areas of life, the university students took a shift broadly in a leftward direction. The influence of the war was quite important. In 1945, Fort Hare was admitted as a member of NUSAS, and the focus of NUSAS in those years going forward was really about much more on black white interaction. But NUSAS remained a white-dominated organization with only white presidents, and black membership was small for a variety of reasons, not least of which was that there were very few black university students. Black students were in a very small minority, and white students were dominant for all the reasons which we know. 1956 was a turning point in NUSAS's history. That was when the government announced its intention to introduce apartheid in the universities. Up till then, the universities had the right to decide whom they would admit as students. Some had used that opportunity to admit all students, and some hadn't. UCT was one of the so-called open universities where there were which were not restricted to whites, but again, black students were in a small minority. But anyway, in 1956, government announces university apartheid, and that makes NUSAS really political for the first time since it was established in 1924, because now it becomes involved in a national political issue to campaign against university apartheid. And over a period of 3 years, there's a series of campaigns, protests, marches, demonstrations. There's a march through Cape Town led by the Chancellor of this university, who was a former Chief Justice. His name is commemorated across the road, St. Livers, who was the Chancellor of UCT, was a former Chief Justice. And from the mid-1950s onwards, NUSAS becomes much more political, much less internally focused on the needs of students and much more interested in what's going on around the world and in South Africa. In 1959, university apartheid is finally introduced, and it's difficult to overemphasize the impact that had on the universities. Even though the number of black students at a university like UCT was relatively small, it was a growing number and they were having an impact. Suddenly that was cut off, and UCT became, for all practical purposes, a white university. The black students at UCT were in a very small minority. They were a submerged minority. They were at risk if they put their heads up too high of being excluded from the university because they could only attend UCT by a government permit. And the result is that student politics then becomes overwhelmingly white at a place like UCT. The black students, as I say, are a very much a submerged minority. Virtually no African students at all. Some coloured and Indian students at medical school, and in some courses there was a course. If you wanted to attend one of these so-called white universities, you had to prove that you couldn't attend, and you weren't white. You had to prove that you couldn't do the studies that you wanted at the university, which was supposedly designated for you. And at UCT, a very popular course became GALAP, a course called GALAP, Greek and Roman Literature and Philosophy. A lot of black students registered for that. Sudden upsurge of interest in Greek and Roman literature and philosophy. Obviously people getting into UCT and then doing what they really wanted to do. But so that's the story of the 50s, and then in the 1960s, NUSAS takes a turn further left. And the student leadership, frustrated by, remember what we're talking about, the early 60s, we're talking about the banning of the liberation movements, we're talking about Sharpeville, we're talking about the first serious campaigns for international isolation of apartheid South Africa, and the students, and a massive suppression of opposition, the Rivonia trial, Little Rivonia, and so on. And so the students become a focus of activity. They become one of the places where there's still visible leftish activity. And NUSAS was a focus for that. There was a famous speech given by the NUSAS president, John T. Driver, at a NUSAS seminar on Botha's Hill in Natal. John T. Driver's in town. I'll tell you about John T. Driver in a moment. But he made a famous speech in which he said it was time to move from protest politics to what he called real action for liberation. It was close to a call for NUSAS to get involved in revolutionary politics. He was promptly denounced by the NUSAS membership. There was the African resistance movement, which was formed, which was a mainly white, not exclusively white, group of young people, mainly young people who engaged in acts of sabotage. They included a former president of NUSAS. And in 1963, John Vorster, who was I think he was then already the Prime Minister, he was probably the biggest thug ever to run any country. Certainly the biggest thug ever to run South Africa. He described NUSAS as a cancer in the life of the nation that must be cut out. So everything was going swimmingly, you'd think. And at that time, and that brings me to the second stage of what I want to talk about, is what's happening to the black students in NUSAS. Because NUSAS is an open organization, but it's white-dominated, white-run. It has black leaders, but most of the leaders are white, and it is driven mainly by whites, by students from the white universities. And a turning point happens in 1967, when the NUSAS Congress takes place at Rhodes University. The Rhodes Vice-Chancellor was a right-winger, and he issued an instruction that the accommodation of the students had to be segregated, and the eating facilities of the students had to be segregated. So you had this New South Congress with black and white students coming together for the sessions and then going to eat separately, and in the evenings going to stay in separate accommodation. The black students were understandably outraged. They were outraged also by the weakness of the response of the white students. And that in many ways, the 1967 Rhodes Congress was a turning point, and it was the first national NUSAS event that Steve Biko attended. Biko was at the 67 NUSAS Congress as an observer. 1968 NUSAS Congress takes place again, and Biko is there again with others, and they discuss their role within NUSAS, and they say we are actually second-class citizens in this organization. We are a minority that runs through a white agenda under white leadership. And if you want to ask for the evidence of this, look at what happened at Rhodes last year. And so in 1968, there's a ferment taking place within NUSAS, led by the black students. And in July 1969, the founding conference of SASO is held. SASO becomes the black student organization, South African Students Organization. Initially, SASO recognizes NUSAS still as the national union, and there's a fascinating piece written by Steve Biko at the Times. He said, at that time, now we're talking 1969, he wrote, SASO accepted the principle that in any one country at any time, a national union must be open to all students in that country. And in our country, NUSAS is the national union. And SASO accepts her as such and offers no competition in that direction. By 1970, that had shifted. SASO had now withdrawn recognition of NUSAS as a national organization and was going its own way in the fullest sense. That's when I became involved. My first engagement in a national NUSAS event was at the end of 1970 at a national seminar outside Stellenbosch, which by coincidence was the last national event which the SASO leadership attended. As I came in, they went out. I hope it was a coincidence. But that was where I first got to know Steve Biko and many of the other SASO leaders who had emerged and who were very powerful and quite unsettling to a young white person who had arrived at university knowing that he knew what was right, which was a pretty liberal view of the world, and suddenly being told, no, it was all wrong. And I think we were all challenged. Certainly I was fundamentally challenged by Biko and by the Black Consciousness students, by SASO. Biko had a very big influence on my life and his colleagues, and I certainly wasn't alone. So what were they saying to us? What were these black students who were supposedly our comrades or our partners in the struggle against racism, what were they saying to us? Well, they had four critiques of what we were doing. They had a political critique, which said whites inevitably take over and dominate supposedly non-racial organizations. And they said, if you want the evidence, look around you. Secondly, they had a psychological or cultural critique. They said that when white people talk about integration, what they really mean is black people must become like white people in order to be admitted as white people. And you're very welcome as long as you are like us, and we wish more of you were like us, and we will encourage you to be like us, and when you are like us, we will all be together. It will be great. That's what's called non-racial. So there was a psychological and cultural critique saying, you just want us to absorb your values and your practices, and then you'll accept us. Thirdly, there was an economic critique, because a lot of the so-called non-racial activity was very much a pro-business activity, which was about capitalism being open to everyone. And the complaint was everybody should be allowed to be capitalists, access to the capitalist system, not just white people. And of course there was a critique of that. Although the early proponents of black consciousness didn't have a very great deal to say about that. And then fourthly, there was a personal critique, that the SASO students said, well, you are the sons and daughters of the holders of power, and you live very comfortably under the situation of privilege. And how can we be comrades in the struggle against this privilege when you are, your parents are the authors and you are the beneficiaries. I'm putting it very crudely, but you've heard it before, you know what I'm talking about. And so the personal critique was based on a lot of cynicism, and the black students pointed out that the white students, having completed their rebellious university days, usually settled very comfortably into white society as soon as they left. It's also something that may have some familiarity to you. So, what was the response from USAS? The initial response was denial. It was to say, oh no, well this is racist, because we are all non-racial. And to say you have a separate black organization is just what the government is saying. One of the curiosities, of course, at the time is that government newspapers were initially very enthusiastic about this. They said, you see, blacks and whites can't be in the same place. That's what we've said all along. You fools in USAS, don't you understand that? Now these black students, or non-white students, realize that they're teaching you the error of your ways. But in any event, there was an initial response of denial, and then USAS in 1970, at its Congress, recognized that SASO was actually better able to represent black students than it was. That was a practical reality. It accepted that, and in successive years it gave instructions to its office bearers not to engage on the black campuses unless requested to do so by black students. So USAS sort of drew back, but it was a very hotly contested issue. I remember, it's interesting being here at the time of the SRC election. I was on the UCT SRC at the time, and I remember a furious debate in 1970 in which we debated whether to accept that SASO was the body best able to represent black students. It sounds so obvious now, doesn't it? But it was a furious debate decided by a thin majority of one that we said, yes, SASO were best able to represent black students. I'm sure they were very grateful for that. But in any event, USAS was challenged now by this. USAS had to accept that it was actually a white organization for all practical purposes. And the question was, what was it going to do? And USAS underwent its own transformation, triggered in some ways by the challenge from the black consciousness movement. And in 1970 and 1971, there was a major reassessment of USAS. It restructured. It moved away from protest politics towards more practical politics on the ground. It was radicalized. That was the story of 1970, 71, 72. And in 1973, the inevitable happened. 8 USAS leaders were banned. The government showed a fine sense of irony or humor, I'm not sure which it was. But at the same time they banned 8 white students, they banned 8 black students, just to show it was even-handed, nothing racist about them. So we had now moved, USAS had moved, and it became involved in much more practical activities. It became involved in literacy campaigns and organizations, became involved in what were called the wages commissions, which were working with black workers, helping them to organize and to mobilize around wage demands, and it moved into a range of more radical campaigns than Geoff Budlender had run in the past. But the problem remained, what were whites actually supposed to do? Because the sort of thing you heard from some of the black students was, well, don't tell us about racism, go and tell Van der Merwe. I remember Steve saying that. You go and speak to Van der Merwe, and then talk to me about this. It was saying, speak to the white community. But of course, speaking to the white community was a very unattractive proposition. The white community was very comfortable, very satisfied, and it wasn't really interested in hearing these long-haired students talk about the need for radical change. They thought the students were quite mad. And so no one ever really figured out what this all meant. There was a book published called White Liberation in 1972. And let me read you what's said, and you may find some of this. 1972, so this is 43 years ago. This is what Horst Planchfeld, who was the editor of the booklet, and a former deputy president of USAS, as it happened, says. He says, blacks do not see it as their task to change the white man. Their need is to teach and lead the oppressed, to free the individual of all dependency relationships upon the white man, who is seen as perpetuating the state of his incarceration. Whites who support a program of white consciousness no longer see their task as developing programs for black people. Their search is to find out who they are as white South Africans, what they stand for, and what new kind of new action is required of them. Those who are developing a new white consciousness are seeking awareness of their whiteness and its role in race problems. In being aware, whites cannot be colorblind, because to deny one's whiteness eliminates neither the fact nor the problem of white privilege. As our entire society is color conscious, the liberal assertion that color consciousness only serves to perpetuate division is simply not valid. Secondly, in being aware, whites cannot be assimilated into black society. Some whites have rejected white values so completely and have so identified with blacks that they now wish to deny their own whiteness. And in order to do this, they try desperately to get personal recognition from blacks for being, quote, almost black. New whiteness challenges whites who attempt to live off black consciousness and black power. New whites question the radical hate many have for their whiteness. Whiteness cannot be denied through efforts to be black. Now that may have some resonances. For how many years? 43 years later. But that sounded great. But it didn't really tell you what you were going to do as a white person. Because you didn't want to go and run in white parliamentary elections. That was clearly no place to go. What were you going to do? And so people who were challenged by black consciousness tried to find a way to engage. The underlying theme of the position which leftish white students took at that time was to say, what we've got to do is be supportive of black initiative. That was like the rallying cry. So now what did it mean to be supportive of black initiative? It meant not taking over. It meant participating where you were welcome and where your skills could be used and where you could use them in a way in which they didn't dominate and oppress. And people found ways to do that. People found ways to do that as trade unionists, as lawyers, as journalists, as academics, in a variety of ways. But it wasn't easy to find a place of direct political engagement because there seemed to be no space for a direct political engagement. The most effective thing that some people did was work in the trade union movement. That's my view anyway. That, as it happened, was where the black consciousness movement was at its weakest. The black consciousness trade unions never really successfully took off. Very few of them. And so New SAS in the young white lefties in the mid-1970s were in this space where they were saying, well, now it's all about being supportive of black initiative, but recognizing we can't be active participants in this political struggle which has to be black-led. That changed over time. When it changed over a period into the 1980s, I mean, there was, in the second half of the 1970s, here's something which will also ring a bell. New SAS ran campaigns aimed at white students around the theme of Africanization, stressing the African as opposed to European future of South Africa and the universities. And New SAS leaders tried to relate what they were doing on the white campuses to what was going on in black campuses and in the black world. There were campaigns around the release of political prisoners. There was a campaign with COSAS and with OSASO against the celebration of Republic Day. And there was the beginning of a new political cooperation taking place now from the basis of separate organizations saying, let's find where is there common ground in which we could cooperate. Only possible because now the black organizations were becoming, I think, were becoming more self-confident, more able to say, well, we can do this on our terms now. We don't have to wait for you. We don't have to listen to you. We're dominated by you. We can do this either on our terms or as equal partners, depending on what you want to call it. There was a very important campaign amongst whites called the End Conscription Campaign, which is there was military conscription for young white men. That became particularly problematic from the late 1960s, 1967, I think the war in Namibia started. White conscripts were sent to fight a war in Namibia, fight against the Swapos, the Swapo-led struggle for independence in Namibia. Then they were sent to Angola to fight wars in Angola. And the End Conscription Campaign was a campaign aimed at young white people, saying you don't have to be part of this. You must resist apartheid by resisting being conscripted into the military. For your pains, you got 2 years in jail. So the white response started to shift And it was able to shift because the black position was changing. Because now there was a more self-confident black leadership. Because remember, until 1976 was the year of the Soweto student uprisings. And the Soweto student uprisings, and which were actually national uprisings, and the emergence of the black consciousness movement in the early 1970s, and the emergence of an independent trade union movement in the early 1970s, all coalesced to change South Africa's politics in a quite fundamental way. Because now there was visible black resistance of a kind to which you could see, and a kind to which it was possible for white people to relate in a different sort of way. And so as the national politics changed, so it became less fraught for white people, because they could say, well, we can see this and we can engage with this and we can play a role. But no one yet had worked out what white consciousness or white liberation meant. And I think today, till today, no one has quite worked that out. So that's a potted history of where we got to until 1994, by which stage NUSAS went out of existence shortly after that, and the recent history we're all familiar with. The change to the democratic era, of course, changed everything fundamentally and changed some things not at all. So if one goes back to the critique which the black consciousness students raised with NUSAS in the late 60s, where were we then 20, 25 years later? What had happened to that critique? What was the continued relevance of black consciousness, if there was any? And I'll read you something that I wrote, so you can criticize it on that ground. There was a conference in Harare in 1990 on the topic was the legacy of Steve Biko and black consciousness. And I was asked to give a paper on whites, the response of whites to black consciousness. And what I said was the following. I'll read it briefly and then I'll finish. I said that I talked about the different critiques of which have been offered. And I said the political critique pointed to the inevitability of white domination of shared organizations. This can surely no longer be the case, at least as far as mass-based organizations are concerned. However, that doesn't lay the issue to rest. It needs to be recognized that when they join any organization, white people sometimes bring with them resources and skills and habits of domination, which potentially give them a weight and influence out of proportion to their numbers. The remnants of white power remain intact, and all white people carry part of that legacy with them, both as a privilege and as a burden. It must be acknowledged that for good reason, suspicion and reserve have not disappeared. White people who engage politically without being aware of this do so at great risk. Of the psychological and cultural critique, I said it pointed to the dominant character of white culture and the destruction and denigration, an intentional word, of black culture through generations of ideological, legal, and economic attack. The changed political context does not automatically change this issue. Unless it is addressed, black South Africans will remain fundamentally disadvantaged and discriminated against. Only those who can adapt successfully to the still dominant white culture will be able to succeed in the new legally non-racial society. The result will be the impoverishment of all South Africans. A truly democratic South Africa will have to embrace the cultural value of all of its citizens. The economic critique had been that liberalism was the philosophical underpinning of capitalism and called only for more or less equal opportunity to exploit. As South Africa deracializes, the significance of this critique is likely to increase. Conversely, the relevance of the color of an exploitative employer or landowner will surely decrease. Paradoxically, therefore, as the significance of the economic critique of liberalism increases, so the relevance of black consciousness as an answer will surely diminish. And then as to the personal critique which challenged the good faith of the white liberals, that I suggested that challenge remains valid today. Many students of the early 1970s responded by dropping out, thereby attempting to disengage themselves from the exploitative and oppressive white power structure. Today the challenge is to find ways of opting in ways which make a constructive contribution to the building of a new society, and not just during a few years at university, but on a long-term basis. And so, to conclude, it seems to me that the somebody once said, and I think it's a truth, that the fundamental tension, one of the fundamental tensions and paradoxes in South Africa in 2000, in 2005, and in 2015 is that most white people think that the change has now happened. It happened in 1994 or shortly thereafter, and people who are subject to apartheid should now stop complaining about it. Most black people are still waiting for the change to happen because the material conditions of their lives haven't changed very substantially. And the difficulty that we face, I think, as white people who are concerned about this, and let me address myself principally to the white people in the audience, is how to convey that fact, how to disrupt. I think disrupting, what do you call it? Disrupting whiteness is a very good term. Because I think that's exactly what it's about. It's about disrupting white power, disrupting white privilege, and disrupting white arrogance, which continue to be with us and in very large measure. That doesn't mean saying, I think, doesn't mean saying that white people can work only with white people. I think if there ever was a time, that time has passed. I'm not sure that there ever really was such a time. But if there was a time, I think that time has passed. It doesn't mean being apologetic about being white. We are who we are. We're all one way or another. But it means recognizing who we are and facing it with humility and trying to do it. It's all about, I think, forcing ourselves, which is the first step, and then forcing other people to recognize the realities in which we live and to recognize that we don't live in a rainbow nation. If you would like to live in a rainbow nation, and many of us would like to live in a rainbow nation, and it may well be something well worth striving for. We ain't there yet, and we're a very long way from there. Necessary to say, we don't live in that country which we idealized in our constitution. We live in a different country. We haven't got to the place that we promised to us in 94 when the first interim constitution came into force, and in 96 when the final constitution came into force. We haven't reached, and we're a long way from reaching, the society which we promised ourselves we were going to build at that time. That's not just the fault of whites. Let's be absolutely clear about that. That whites have a role to play in recognizing that this is the case and doing what they can to challenge it and to disrupt it. I greatly respect little I know, but I hear about what you're doing. I think that you're on the right track in saying we've got to get to grips with what it is to be white. You can't just deny it. And you've got to get to grips with what is the role of a young person who is white in 2015. We can't just close our eyes and say today we live in the rainbow nation. Race is a thing of the past. Race is with us, it will be with us for a while. It's not the only important thing, but it is such a powerful, powerful social phenomenon that I think you're right to say this is something that we have to take on. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Geoff. We just